Hey guys, it's Landon Blake with TBAS and I'm working on a set of videos, just cover some basic math that land surveyors need. I'm doing that for some junior members of my team, some of the folks that work for me. So I think most of those folks have a pretty good handle on just basic algebra, but I wanted to go ahead and do one or two videos just on some basic algebra. Just kind of as a refresher for some people on my team, and then it might help some other folks out there. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to start that in this video. I don't know if I'm going to get all the algebra in one video or not. We'll see. But I want to do some basic algebra, and then I need to do a half a dozen or so videos on trigonometry. Trigonometry is something that surveyors use a lot. I know it sounds scary, but it's really not that scary. We're going to make it. We're going to try and make it simple. So, but to properly use trigonometry and geometry, which is another math tool that surveyors use, it's good to have a solid understanding of algebra, basic algebra. So I took a lot of algebra. I've sat through several algebra classes, at least a few. There's a lot of algebra that I don't use as a land surveyor. So I learned a lot of algebra that I didn't use. So we're not going to teach all that stuff because this is taught by a surveyor.org, not taught by a math teacher.org, right? So we're not going to get into all the algebra. But we're going to give you the basic tools of algebra and the things that I think are important for land surveyors to know, or people in kind of related professions like GIS or geography, engineering. So we're going to give you some of those basic algebra tools, okay? And that's what we're going to start to do that in this video. So what do I want to cover in this video? We're going to cover a few different things in this video. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to explain why we add letters to math. Like, math is hard enough with just numbers, right? What crazy person decided to put letters in the mix? So explain why we add letters. There's a simple reason. Okay. We want to know, why are we doing that? Because that's basically what you do in algebra. Okay. You add letters. Okay. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to just define some basic algebra terms. Okay. Now, the reason that's important is I'm going to be using those terms as I teach you some basic tools of algebra. And so it's important that we have a common vocabulary. In other words, we're using the same names to talk about the same things. So it's not that the names are necessarily a fundamental principle of the universe, like the speed of light or anything, but it's a common way, or a traditional way to talk about the different parts of algebra. So if we're going to talk to each other about algebra the way that other people do, we need to know what those terms are. Okay. So we're going to define, and don't worry, we're not going to go crazy. There's 3 or 4 things you got to know. Okay. If you're not super familiar with algebra, we also have to explain a couple things about the way people write out the math in algebra. Okay. So there's some special ways they do that. So we're gonna have to take a look at how you multiply and divide in algebra. I'm gonna say how you write multiplication and division in algebra. Okay, multiplication and division in algebra. Okay, and then kind of on a related note, again, this has to do with how we write out the math in algebra. We're going to talk about order of operations in parentheses. Okay? Don't go to sleep. I know you're going to sleep already. Don't go to sleep. Order of operation in parentheses. And again, that's not a fundamental mathematical principle. It's just a tradition. It's just the way people have agreed to write out the math for algebra. Order operations and parentheses. We're going to talk about that. There's no way I'm going to spell this right. Parenthetical, I think it's an E. Parentheses. Hopefully there's no English teachers watching. Okay. My partner Brian will catch this one. He's a spelling and grammar whiz. All right, so we're going to talk about order operations in parentheses. And again, these two right here, they're just so we know how to write and read. It's not going to fit. These two are just so, this isn't really math, it's just convention or tradition, okay? This is just so we know how to write and read algebra. Okay? That's why we need to talk about those two things. Okay. Actually, this one too. You could put these three. Okay. So these three things all together are why we need to learn. We need to learn that just to understand how to write and read the math. Okay. It's not actually solving the math. It's just writing and reading it. Okay. So we're going to talk about that. And part of the reason this is important is because, you know, when you do lower level math, there's a certain way you write out multiplication and division, and then all of a sudden when you get to algebra, that changes, and it kind of changes for the rest of math, right? So like, I don't know who came up with that, but you learn it one way, kind of in elementary school and junior high, and then when you get to algebra, like for the rest of your life, we change how we do multiplication and division. So we got to talk about that. Okay. And then finally, when we get done with all this other stuff, we get to talk about the actual tools in algebra. Algebra tools. Okay, and what I want you to start doing in these videos is think about math as a toolkit. And then the different types of math, those are tools in your toolkit. So the screwdriver, the pair of pliers, or the crescent wrench, whatever it is. Okay. So that's how I want you to think about math. Remember, being a surveyor, it's all about the practical things we can do with math, right? Now, I've told you in some of these videos before, when I was growing up, I didn't like math. Math was my worst subject. And then I learned to be a surveyor, and I kind of saw the practical ways you could apply math and use math to solve real world problems, and that got me really excited. And I like that part of math. And then, so if that's all you learn from these videos is kind of the practical way to use math as a toolkit for solving problems, that's the goal, right? But you may find, as I did as I got older, that you start to appreciate kind of the beautiful parts of math and maybe even get interested in some of the math just for the math itself. I'm not saying that will happen to you, but that happened to me. So that's kind of cool too. Kind of cool too. Another thing about math that's cool, but don't worry if that doesn't happen. If you don't fall in love with math, that's okay. You just got to remember math is just another tool that land surveyors use to solve problems, right? So we're going to talk about how do we actually use this thing called algebra to solve some problems. All right? Okay, so I don't know if we're going to get through all that. I don't know. We're going to try. We may not get through all of it in one video. We may have to split it up. We may do the tools of algebra in a different video. Okay? All right. So let's go ahead and work on why do we add letters to math? We're going to work on this first one here. Okay, I've got another whiteboard over here I'm going to move in. Okay, so why do we add letters to math? It's a good question. I'm going to adjust the camera here for a minute. Okay, it's a good question. You know, you start throwing letters into math and we get all confused. But there's a simple reason why we add letters to math. The letters just represent unknown values. Okay, so it's some value, some measurement or some quantity that we want to know what that value is, but we don't know, and so we need a symbol that we can use to represent it. And so we just use letters. Okay, we didn't have to use letters; we could use shapes. Okay, so I'll give you an example. So in algebra, instead of saying something like 3 times some number I don't know is equal to 9, we use symbols because it's just easier, right? So let me just give you an example. Let's write it out the long way. So we could say 3 times a number I don't know is equal to 9. Okay, so that's the long way to write it out, to write out this math problem in English. Okay. Now here's how we do that in algebra using numbers and letters. Okay. So in algebra we just say 3x equals 9. It's a lot shorter, isn't it? And that's why we add numbers to math. It's a form of what they call shorthand. In other words, it's a way to take a shortcut. It's a way to take all of this, all these words, and say it with just 4 letters and symbols. Okay? Now, most commonly in algebra, the letters that we use are y and x. Okay? So you can see here, that's x. Okay? So we use y and x, but it doesn't have to be y and x. It could be any letters of the alphabet. In fact, sometimes, for example, if you're working with a formula that involves time, you might see the letter T. Okay, if you're working in geometry and you're dealing with the radius of a circle, you might see little r. Okay, and generally in algebra, we're working with lowercase letters. I don't know who came up with that convention, but somebody did. Okay, but I want you to understand the letters are just a symbol to represent a quantity that we don't know. Sometimes it represents a quantity we do know. Okay, but most of the time it's a quantity we don't know. Okay, but it could be any symbol. Okay, so for example, let's just say, you could use shapes if you wanted. So let's just say we have a shape, we're going to use the shape a triangle. We could write the same math problem here with that symbol. Okay, 3 times a number we don't know equals 9. Okay, or maybe we want to use a different, maybe we want to use a square with a dot in it. We could do that too. Okay, 3 equals 9. Okay, so really all of these equations I've written here, we're going to talk about what an equation is in a minute. All of these equations say the same thing as this English statement that we have here at the top. Okay, they all say the same thing. I'm going to try to remember to stand on this side of the whiteboard. Okay, so they all say the same thing. It's just what symbols do we use, and most frequently in algebra we use letters. Now, sometimes we do use symbols in algebra. There's some special numbers that are really hard to write because they go on forever and ever. They're called irrational numbers. I need to do another video on those. Hopefully I won't forget. But so for an example, this is the symbol that we use for pi. Okay, there's a special number called pi. That's the symbol we use for that. And then when we're doing calculus, there's this kind of funny symbol. It's called the integral symbol. It's like a stretched out S. And that basically means sum up all these little pieces or add up all these little pieces. So there's other symbols like that in math, and you have to learn them because people have agreed to use on those symbols. In fact, this is also a symbol. This is the equal symbol. Okay, but that's a symbol that most people are used to. So even if you've never done algebra before, you've practiced with this part. You practice using symbols in your math because you use the equal sign, right? And then we use, in lower level math, we use the X to mean multiply. We use this symbol right here to mean divide. So you're familiar with this concept whether you realize it or not if you've done lower level mathematics. Okay? So that's why we add letters like X. It's so we don't have to write all this stuff out, so we can use shorthand. There's actually a cool video I found on YouTube, and the video explains kind of who invented the equal sign, and they talk in that video a little more about how we use symbols in math as a shortcut, as shorthand. So I'll try and remember to post a link to that in the comments for this video on YouTube. Okay, so that's why we added letters to math in algebra. Okay, now we want to define some basic terms or phrases in algebra. Okay, so I'm going to write a what we call an equation on the board here, and then we'll talk about what that means. Okay, so I'm going to write 3x plus 20 minus 2x equals 14. Okay. Now let's define some terms here. So this whole thing right here is called an equation. Okay, now there's one rule in algebra. To be an equation, you have to have an equal sign somewhere in this line of stuff. Okay, if you don't have an equal sign, it's not an equation. Okay, so if we took away everything over here on this side of the equal sign, what we end up with is what we call an expression. Okay, so if you just have a group of stuff without an equal sign in algebra, that's called an expression. Okay, but almost all the time in algebra we have an equal sign because the equal sign is kind of what makes algebra work. But in some cases, you know, if you crack open a traditional math book, you'll see a problem that says something like solve the expression. Okay, that's just all this stuff without the equal sign. Okay, now these little parts of the expression or the equation that are separated by plus signs and minus signs, these right here, this too, these are all called terms in algebra. Okay, those are called terms. They're like words. That's the mathematician name for a word or a chunk or a part, a little part. They call them terms. I don't know why they decided to do that, but that's what they did. Okay, now, terms are always separated by a minus sign, a plus sign, or an equal sign. That's the rule in algebra. Okay, so this equation right here has 4 terms. 3x is a term, 20 is a term, 2x is a term, and 14 is a term. Okay, now I'm not sure what they call it in algebra. I need another color here. I'm not sure what they call it in algebra, but I know in programming, this plus and the minus right here, okay, in programming, these are called operators. Okay, so I'm just going to use that name in my video. Okay, those are called operators. Okay, so those are just some basic terms in algebra that I want you to learn. Now, so we've done one. We know why we added letters to math. Okay. Now we've got some basic terms defined, right? Expression, equation, terms, operators. Okay. Now, we want to talk a little bit about how we write multiplication and division when we do algebra. And the reason we need to talk about that is because it's different than all the other math, the lower level math that you guys might have done. And so in algebra, we have a special way we do that. Okay, and it has to do with what I taught you about terms a minute ago. Okay, so in lower level math, when you want to multiply 2 numbers, you write something like that, where x is the symbol for multiplication. Okay, and when you want to divide 2 numbers, you write something like this. Oh, sorry, that's not right. When you want to divide, you write something like this. Okay, a line with 2 dots. Okay, so these right here are symbols we use. That's the symbol we use for multiplication, and that's the symbol we use for division. Now, for whatever reason, some mathematicians got together a long time ago and decided that we weren't going to do this in algebra. Don't ask me why. It's because people like to make math hard, especially mathematicians. So, there's some new rules for how you show multiplication and division in algebra. Okay, so the rule for multiplication is if you have 2 numbers right next to each other, without a plus or an equal sign or a minus sign, that means multiply. So when we say 3x, okay, what that really means, if you go back to elementary school or junior high, what that means is, let me use a different example because that's going to be confusing. If we have 3y, so if that's our term, 3y, okay, what that really means, if you go back to elementary school, is it means 3 times y. Okay. And then in algebra, we always show division as a fraction, because that's what a fraction is. A fraction is another way to represent division. So in algebra, 3 divided by y, okay, just means 3 divided by y. That's how you write it in elementary school or junior high. Okay, and you can see part of the reason they do this is when you start mixing these letters in with the division and multiplication symbol, things get confusing, right? So we don't write it like that. Okay, so this really means, if you go back up here to this equation at the top, this means 3 times x, and this means 2 times x. Okay, that's what that means. So that's how we write multiplication and division. Okay, now if you want to show that you're multiplying two numbers together, so example 3 times 6, so if this is a number and not a symbol, you don't do that in algebra because this looks like the number 36. Okay, so if you want to show that these two things are getting multiplied together, we use parentheses in algebra to do that. So what you could write is 3 and 6 in parentheses. If these are next to each other without a space, this right here, when you do this, this means multiply. That's what that means, multiply. Okay. So both of these expressions are equivalent or equal. So I could write 3x, or I could write 3 in parentheses times x in parentheses. They mean the same thing in algebra. They just mean multiply 3 by x. Okay. By the way, that's also equal to 3 times x. Okay. You can see why they don't do this. It gets confusing. All right. So that's how we write multiplication and division. Okay, so now we want to talk about the order of operations, or how we use parentheses in algebra. Okay. And there's a whole set of rules that go into order of operations. I'm not going to get into those because I don't really use them as a surveyor, to be honest with you. I haven't used them since college. But I do want to talk about the simplest form of order of operations in parentheses. And the general rule is you do the math that's in the parentheses first. Okay, so if we had something like 3 times, remember, this means times, right? This means times. So 3 times 10 minus 2. You do this math first. So you always do the math in the parentheses first, right? So that's another way of writing 3 times 8, because 10 minus 2 is 8. Okay? So you always do the math in the parentheses first. Now let's say you had something really weird. So you have 3 times 10 minus 4 minus 2. So this is what we call nested parentheses. You always start with the inner parentheses and then work your way out. So you're going to do this math first. So this is 2. Okay. 10 minus 2 times 3. Okay. Then you get back to here. Okay. So those are just the general rules about order of operations. I don't know that we're going to see a ton of that in the algebra that we do, but I wanted to explain it. Okay. All right. That's probably enough for one video. So we're going to pause, and then we're going to come back. We're going to talk about number 5 here, which I erased. Number 5 is some of the basic tools of algebra. There's five, maybe 6 basic tools in algebra that I'm going to teach you. They're the only tools you're ever going to need, algebra tools you're ever going to need if you want to be a land surveyor. Okay? So we'll do that in the next video.